Good afternoon. I'm Paul Glumaz, and I'm with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And this is being brought to you by General Welfare Presents. And today is April 26th. And the best way that I can characterize what is going on, and everything's very confusing for most people, not just the people in general, but also people in institutions, people at the highest levels of institutions. It's all very confusing. And the reason that it is because we are in the middle of two paradigms. One paradigm is the new paradigm that the movement of Lyndon LaRouche is associated with, which has been adopted by a lot of countries, especially China. And the other paradigm is the paradigm that we've been living under, brutally living under, largely since the end of World War II, or since the beginning of the Cold War. Now, if you were to look at this from the standpoint of an individual, you would say that this individual has two personalities. One personality is in one paradigm, and then the other personality is in another paradigm. And we're dealing with a situation where you have nations and even their leaders exhibiting this kind of political schizophrenia, in that one day they'll say one thing in one paradigm, and the other day they'll say something else in another paradigm. I think President Donald Trump might be an example of somebody who's in both paradigms, and that would be the case for a lot of people in positions of influence. And you have to understand, one paradigm, that is the paradigm we've been living under mostly, is a paradigm based on the survival of the fittest, competition, king of the hill. If you're not on top, you're on the bottom. If you're not a jerk, you're going to be taken for a ride, and so forth and so on. And in the geopolitical, it's also geopolitics. It's the balance of power. It's all nations are inherent enemies against all nations, and you have a balance of power, and that's how you have stability, is when you have a balance of power between opposing blocks of nations. And this is Henry Kissinger. This is geopolitics. Now, but that I'm not talking about who created that. I'm talking more about the state of mind that we can go into that, who created it, at some other time. But I'm talking about the state of mind that people have been living under. And then you have this other paradigm, which is the new paradigm, which is quite the opposite. It says, no, every nation is a potential benefactor to every nation. Every nation's development can help every other nation develop. This is summed up by Xi Jinping, the president of China, and what he calls win-win. And this paradigm, you do not look at your neighbor as an enemy, you do not look at a powerful country as an opponent, but you look at the powerful country as a resource for your own development. That's a very strange way of thinking for people that have been suffering under the paradigm of survival of the fittest. It's a very strange sort of idea. What do you mean? Russia and China should be our friends? What do you mean? China could help America build its railway system? What are you talking about? That's not how the real world works. It's a doggy world. We gotta fight. Fight for the crumbs. That kind of mentality is really dominant. And so we're in a situation where, in the last 4 years, the Chinese have adopted the One Belt, One Road, which is now 11 times the Marshall Plan that built Europe in terms of its size of activity, and within 10 years, it's expected to be 20 times the size of the activity that rebuilt Europe after World War II. So this is huge. This is this is the transformation of the world. At the same time that you have this other paradigm that we've been living under is completely dominating our mind, and the media has kept you from knowing that there are two paradigms. But despite that, the paradigm of win-win is starting to seep in all over the world, and so people are starting to act in schizophrenic ways, politically schizophrenic ways, as far as their worldview, as far as how that how they look at the international picture, at the global strategic picture. Now you have to understand that Americans have been suffering since the beginning of the Cold War from this paradigm of fear. Fear of the Soviet Union, fear of the successor to the Soviet Union, which is Russia, fear of communist China, fear of the successor to communist China, which is reformed communist China, a state capitalist, perhaps reformed communist China, and fear of terrorism, fear of the enemy. Fear, we got to have an enemy. An enemy is necessary for our very functioning, our very identity. If we don't have a world where we're surrounded by enemies, then we have to, we have no sense of self, because our sense of self is completely connected to our opposition. So you have a lot of people in the United States who, if they discovered that the United States were working with China for building the railway system, of creating a modern railway system in the United States, which China is willing to invest in, oh, this is terrible. We're going to be taken over by China. We're going to be owned by the Chinese. This can't be allowed. We would rather suffer extreme poverty than allow, in our dilapidated industrial nation, than have the Chinese help us rebuild our country. That would be, that would be terrible. That's the mindset of having to constantly live with the enemy. The enemy. We are defined by our enemy. We are defined by our fear of the enemy. Our very deep psychological sense of self is connected to that. And so we have this problem where, if you were to carry forward that psychological state of mind into the current situation, the development of China, the development of India, the development of the world will create the impulse to go to nuclear war, because we can't afford to have friends. We can't afford to have development. We can't afford to be allies with all these forces. We have to have our identity. We have to have ourself. So this impels us to go to nuclear war because of the psychosis that we have been under, which has been manipulated. And the British have set this up. The British set up the Cold War. Churchill set up the Cold War, and the FBI enforced the witch hunt and the scares against so-called communists inside our country, or socialists, or liberals, or whatever. That whole thing is deeply ingrained in our psyche. And how are we as a nation, how are we as a people going to get past that? Now, to give you a sense of this, of the win-win paradigm, of this paradigm, to give you a sense of how fast it's moving, China, its business section, just signed a memorandum of understanding in Beirut, Lebanon, with all of the Arab Chamber of Commerces about preparing business agreements and business deals and contracts for involvement of China with the Arab business community throughout the Middle East in the construction of Iraq and Syria, which have been devastated by the last 14 years since the invasion of Iraq, and everything that's followed that. And the war there hasn't been resolved. It has not been resolved, yet the Chinese and the Arab business community are now already preparing for reconstruction. And so somebody will say, well, that's insane. But the Chinese are saying, well, we're going to go ahead and do that, because if we do that in advance, that will contribute to resolving the situation there. In other words, in the win-win paradigm, in the every country is put your potential ally and friend because they can help you develop and you can help them develop. In that paradigm, uh, uh, the way you have peace is through economic development, cooperation in economic development. That's how you get peace. But peace, we can't have peace. We have no reason to exist if we don't have peace, because we as Americans have no positive identity. We have destroyed our positive identity, and instead we have an anti-identity. We have an anti-Russian identity, an anti-China identity, an anti-Muslim identity, an anti-immigrant identity, an anti-destruction of the planet Earth identity. We do not have a positive identity as human beings centered upon the development of our nation. We have an anti-development identity in the case of the Greens. We have an anti-civilizational identity in the case of everybody else, because we're trapped in this feral survival of the fittest psychosis, and it's really a sickness. But it is the paradigm that we've been living under, increasing, especially since the Cold War, and that paradigm has been enforced by the media. That paradigm has been maintained upon our people, and and every effort by previous presidents and others to kind of somehow find a way out of that paradigm always encounters of all kinds of incidences that are used to inflame the situation. So you can never quite work out agreements. And North Korea is the best example of this. The North Korean situation has been as it is since the end of the Korean War in 1952. Now that's 65 years. 65 years have been like this. And while the Korean situation was well on to being resolved, the North Korean situation was well on to being resolved in the 1990s, going into the 2000 period. The Dick Cheney crowd and the Obama crowd were totally opposed to that, because they were totally opposed to the idea that you could ultimately economically incorporate North Korea, get them to abandon their missile and nuclear program, and ultimately, which was going on, by the way, during the Clinton administration into the Bush administration. You give up their nuclear weapons and their missile program in exchange for economic development. That was going on. There were South Korean and North Korean ventures that were well underway, and this all got destroyed by the Cheney crowd, because you cannot have a world where there's mutual cooperation and development. That's a world that these people are not unwilling to live in. People like Dick Cheney, people like Lindsey Graham, John McCain, even Chuck Schumer or Hillary Clinton or these Democrats. They can't live in that world either, because if they do, then they have to take a look at all the horror of what they've lived through, and they have to look at the horror of our nation and the fact that we didn't develop. We became a post-industrial society. You know, they have to account for all of that, because they did that on the base. We went to Vietnam for what reason? To enforce a global colonial system and to prevent Vietnam from becoming a liberated, a self-determined nation. And what did we do? We ended up destroying our nation, because we ended up wasting all our effort in Vietnam, and we didn't use the effort at home. The same thing with the series of wars that we've been under since 2003 in the Middle East. Same thing. Whatever, $6 trillion, but it's not the money. That's the only thing. The war machine is the only thing left in our nation that we have as an economy. How do we transition out of that into development? Well, the Chinese are saying, we'll help you. Oh, no, you can't allow the Chinese to be involved in rebuilding our infrastructure, our dilapidated infrastructure, because if you do, then they own us, right? We don't want to be owned by the Chinese, but that's the paradigm. We don't want to be owned by the Chinese. It's better to die than allow the Chinese to develop our nation. Better to go to war with China than allow them to develop our nation. We don't want to be under Chink rule. Well, no, you won't be under Chink rule. What the Chinese are not asking you to surrender, they're saying, look, we have all this capability to export this technology to you, to develop you, and then you will have the means to export technology to develop us. What's wrong with that? No, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't be friends. No, I can't live in a world where I don't have an enemy. I can't live in a world where I can't be against something. Okay? And that's the kind of situation that we're in right now. And we're in a very critical situation. Now, we have a president who does like development, who does like scientific and technological progress. He just did a whole thing with NASA. He really wants for scientific improvement, scientific development. He really wants that. But he's trapped in these two paradigms. He may himself have part of himself in one paradigm, but he's got the other paradigm there as well. And so it's a very weird situation. And then in the context of this, the British, this is very important. The British are freaking out because they see this motion towards the paradigm of win-win all over the world. The empire's going down. They see European countries getting ready to break with the existing order and work with China. They see Eastern European countries getting ready to do this. They see the Brexit. They see Italy. They see France. They see all these countries. And they wonder, okay, when are we no longer in charge? Through the London financial system, through our vast intelligence services. When are we no longer in charge? So the other day, the Defense Secretary of Defense, Fallon, announced that, yes, it is the case that Britain, Theresa May would use preemptively nuclear weapons without an immediate nuclear threat for unspecified reasons. This is the first time anyone's admitted that they would first strike without being under the threat of nuclear attack. And then the Jeremy Wright, the Queen's Counsel, the lawyer for the Queen, weighed in on the Tony Blair case, saying that it may be against international law to wage aggressive war, but it's not against United Kingdom law to wage aggressive war preemptively. So they're announcing in advance that they're getting very freaked out, and that Britain has a Trident missile program, Trident submarines, and they will be using those on their own without necessarily consulting the United States. That's how freaked out they are. Okay, so we're in a very tumultuous situation. We're caught between two paradigms, and the paradigm that the LaRouche movement has been representing for its entire existence of over 50 years, that paradigm is now taking over. But the other paradigm is going crazy, and people are confused. They're going nuts, on this, because they have lived under this system. They have lived under the system for some time. So that's pretty much where we are. Now, on top of that, we have another round of financial crisis coming. The real estate situation is another crisis. Corporate debt is another crisis. And we're now heading into another crisis. And so the Trump administration has issued an executive order to examine the Dodd-Frank, which is a very complex situation. So at this point, it looks like the administration is looking to examine what they're dealing with, what the actual law is, because it's not clear what the actual law is. The Dodd-Frank is very confusing, but there is in Dodd-Frank the confiscation of deposits in the event of a systemic crisis with a major bank. Because that major bank goes under, all the major banks go under. So they have this provision for resolving the financial crisis by converting deposits or uh, bank paper into stock, and that's called a bail-in. So we're heading into the financial storm on top of all of this. Now, to give you a sense of how fast this new paradigm is going, um, China and Greece and a number of other countries, 10 countries, have formed a great civilizations to 10. These are 10 nations which have had in the past major civilizations. And the nations involved are Greece, Italy, Syria, Iraq, Iran, India, China, Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. And these nations had their first conference in Greece. And what this is this idea that that we have a cultural inheritance. You know, we're not just people. We have we're products of from ancient civilization to the present. We're products of civilization. We are not just born out of nothing. We are products of civilization, and our civilizational heritage is our inheritance, and that inheritance is what gives us the cognitive powers and the cultures that that you know elevate human beings out of barbarism, and so these nations are meeting to look at the unification of this concept that we come from civilization. We don't come from survival of the fittest. And so this is a very big development as part of developing and expanding the paradigm of win-win of global development. Okay, and this cultural heritage, this cultural inheritance, is the most important thing that we have. If we are disconnected from the best of our cultural inheritance, then we are diminished dramatically in our understanding, in our sense of self. And this is very important because what's happened to the United States is they have not only lost their heritage, of the best heritage, which comes from Europe, which comes from the European Renaissance, which is reflected in the American Revolution and Abraham Lincoln and FDR, but they have essentially lost that and replaced it with a sense of the enemy, as I've described earlier. So this idea of reviving the idea that the planet has had many advanced civilizations, and those advanced civilizations need to be understood to be part of our heritage and need to be understood as part of our developing our sense of the multiplicity of our humanity. Not that one thing is better than the other, not that this culture is better than the other per se, but rather what we can share with each other historically and currently is the most essential thing for our future. And this is why they're doing this. And this is very profound. This is very profound. So we are at this point right now. And today, Donald Trump has invited all 100 senators to the White House to discuss the North Korea situation with Secretary of Defense Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson, with Chief of Staff Dunford, and with the head of the NSA. Now, this North Korea situation is epitomizes this the crisis around North Korea epitomizes this caught between two paradigms. The Chinese are saying to the U.S., back off, back down, back off. They're saying to the North Koreans, back down, back off. Let's, don't go into a pressure this thing into a confrontation. The Trump administration is behaving like, okay, we want to resolve this thing now. We want it resolved now. We want Korea to give it up now or else. And that is the old paradigm. Okay, and the Chinese are saying no. Let's work it through. Let's take our time. The fact that Donald Trump is talking to Xi Jinping is potentially very good because Xi Jinping can help Donald Trump understand some of these things. But on the other hand, this pressure to resolve the situation immediately is not is very problematic. So we don't know how this is all going to turn out. It could go to nuclear war. It could be resolved. But if it's resolved, then the whole collapse of the neocons will take place because they need that North Korea. They need North Korea as an enemy because it's very important for their identity. It's very important for the sense. They have to find another enemy.